Hi there. I was digging around my fabric stash and I found something that's kind of rare. I found a cotton knit, a cotton woven, and even a canvas that are pretty close to the same color. That's not very common. This is one of my favorite blouses, and it has a knit and a woven, and they're the same color. Now, the manufacturer had the luxury of probably having them dyed to match, but I don't have that option. So I thought, what a great opportunity to show you all the different ways our sewing machine can sew knits, can sew wovens, and how the different features in the machine can help us. Now, this is not a video on how to put the garment together. This is a video on how our sewing machine is going to help us save time when we sew, to do seams, to use some of those fun features. Now, when I do a garment, a lot of times I'll use my serger, but I'm not going to do that for this video. I'm going to show you the different ways that we can use our sewing machine to get great results. Hi, I'm Cathy, and this is Sewing Tech Talk. Let's get to the machine. So before I had a dedicated sewing room, I had to put my machine away and take it out every time I wanted to sew. So that's what we're recreating now. That may be true for you. That's why we're going to sew this garment, this whole thing, on this Janome 4120. Because this is the type of machine that you might need to, if that's part of what you have to do to sew, take this machine, put it away, take it back out. This machine is a 3/4 size machine, which means it's a little bit smaller, but it still packs a powerful punch. I'm going to call it Mighty Mini Machine. It comes with an extension table, and it comes with a hard case. So if you have to put it on a shelf or in your closet, that way you can take it down, put it back up for all your sewing needs. Now, what we're going to do in this video is we're going to come and we're going to visit it for the sewing parts of my garment. I'm going to take my garment and show you my fabric and show you all the different ways that I'm going to use the machine to get it where it needs to be as a finished garment. Now, I'm going to have to wash all these fabrics together because they might shrink separately. The woven might be different than the knit. So I'm going to wash them all together. So the first step is I am going to overcast the edge of this fabric so that it doesn't ravel when I wash it. So let's see what we can use on the machine. So this machine has quite a few nice little stitches. I'm going to pick a triple zigzag stitch, which is stitch number 8, and I'm just going to go over the edge and make it so that it doesn't ravel when I wash. So I'm going to choose stitch number 8. So I'm going to come down to the machine, and this machine has a dedicated touchpad to those basic stitches that you're going to use all the time. All I have to do is touch stitch number 8. Now, if I want it a little bit wider, I hit the plus key. And this is no couture sewing. This is just the edge so it doesn't ravel. So I'm going to make the stitch length quite a bit. I'm just capturing those threads. So I'm going to sew this edge, wash everything together, dry it, lay it out, cut as many pieces I can to make as many different parts of this garment that I can. And then when we come back, what I'm going to do, show you knit seams and woven seams. So let's overcast this edge and get busy. So now for this video, we have a giveaway. So if you look down in the description and you like, comment, or share, you could be entered to win, every time you do one of those things, a lovely box of thread. So don't forget, like, comment, and share, and you could be entered in our giveaway. So it's the next day, and I'm going to be going through the basic garment seams on a sewing machine. I am going to talk about a lot of different stuff, so there's a handout. Go to the description, and it's usually highlighted in blue, and you can click on and go to the landing page and download the handout that talks about the seams, what we're going to do, and any of the products that I'm using gives you a reference to those as well. So you have like a little a cheat sheet to not have to take notes. Now, let's do some garment seams. We're going to do a knit seam, knit to knit. We're going to do a woven seam, woven to woven. We're going to stabilize a knit seam. make sure it doesn't stretch. And we're also going to do a knit to woven seam. So we're going to do 4 different types of seams, and after that we're going to see if we can mimic a serger and do that what it looks like, that cover stitch on a knit. So let's get started. Now let's talk about a knit to a knit. We're going to be using the Janome machine, and it's a great electronic machine. Electronic machines give you lots of choices because they have more stitches. The great thing about them is they have more functions. They have needle up and needle down. They have a scissor function where you can clip the stitch. The most important one, because when you're making a garment, you're going to be going back and forth to different types of stitches, different types of seams. When you select a stitch on an electronic machine, it automatically sets it up for you. So if I'm going to go to the knit stitch looks like a little lightning bolt. On this machine, it's stitch number 6. So I touch number 6 and it automatically sets that stitch up for me. I can adjust it if I need to, but I don't have to go to my owner's manual every time I'm going to switch from a different type of seam, which makes it really easy to flow back and forth. So let's do that knit seam. This is a cotton knit. And it's a great knit, very comfortable to wear. But sometimes when you're sewing a cotton knit, what happens is, if you're using a zigzag machine, which you'll need to do that little knit seam, there's a very large opening for that zigzag stitch. And the zigzag stitch opening is large, and the fabric wants to get pulled down into that opening. It's not the machine's fault. It's not the fabric's fault. It's just physics. It wants to get pulled down into that opening. So there's a very simple way to overcome that. I use a piece of tearaway stabilizer, and I just put it over the top of that opening and the very beginning of my knit seam that I'm going to do, and it doesn't let that knit get pulled down in. So I cover over the top of that opening with this tearaway stabilizer. Let me put my foot on. I've chosen my stitch, and on this garment, this pattern that I've chosen, it wants a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This machine has all kinds of markings for the seam allowance on this needle plate. And even the bobbin cover has markings. So I'm pretty successful choosing what I want to use for my seam allowance with the markings on the machine. It comes with a seam guide, which we'll use a little bit later. But I'm going to put my little piece of tearaway stabilizer on. I'm going to bring my fabric up. I'm going to line it up with what I believe to be the 1/4 inch marking. That's pretty good. Now I'm just going to sew, and it's not going to pull that fabric down, and it's a beautiful start. Now this stitch, it's going back and forth, so it's going to take it a little bit of time. This machine has a speed control up here. I'm going to put it all the way to the right. This machine's going to take, the stitch is going to take a little bit of time. So it's even fully depressing the pedal, it's going to take a bit. That's okay. It makes a beautiful stitch. This lightning bolt stitch is great for knits because it goes back and forth and it gives it a little bit of give, what a knit stitch likes. If we were to use a standard straight stitch on this and pull on the fabric, it would pop that stitch out. It also goes a little bit side to side, which means that it's going to have a little bit of give, but we can open that seam out and reduce bulk in the areas that we want to. So I'm going to finish up my seam here. When I'm finished, I'm going to touch the scissor button. And this seam, I'm going to tear away my little bit of stabilizer. Easy peasy. This seam is going to be able to open up and have a little bit of stretch as well. So that's knit to knit, the lightning bolt stitch, that's your friend. Now let's talk about a knit seam that we don't want to have a little bit of stretch of. The shoulder seam, you want to have it stay very stable. So what I do is you can use a seam tape, but what I use is I have a little piece of cutaway stabilizer. And this, unlike the tearaway, is meant to stay with the garment for the entire life of the garment. Now when I'm sewing this seam, I want it to be caught in that seam, and I want it to hold that tape down. So I'm going to select a stitch. On this machine it happens to be stitch number 9. Touch the stitch number and it sets it up automatically for me. I want it to sew a seam on the side and then stitch a little bit over to the right to hold this little tape in place. Now remember, we're still sewing on a knit, so it may want to pull that fabric down through. So I'm going to find my little piece of tearaway, put it on, and actually what I can do, this is about 1/4–3/8 of an inch. It actually fits in the slot of my regular standard foot, and that means as I sew, it's just going to pull it through and I don't even have to worry about it. So let me put this here, put the fabric underneath, still doing that 1/4 inch seam, sticking this stabilizer right in the hole, and lower the presser foot. Good to go. So it sewed that down at the same time that it did the seam. Very good. That's a stable seam on a knit. Now let's talk about doing a woven seam. Now a woven seam is a little bit different than a knit, because a woven fabrics, almost all woven fabrics, love to ravel, some more than others. So what we're going to have to do on the woven seam is we're going to have to overcast over the edge of the fabric so that it doesn't ravel. A serger is excellent at this function. It'll do that beautiful professional overcasting edge. We're not using a serger for this, we're using our sewing machine, and you may not have a serger yet. So let's talk about doing this edge. Now I'm going to choose a stitch called a triple zigzag. On this machine it's stitch number 8, and that means unlike a regular zigzag that goes side to side, this one puts a stitch in the middle when it's going over to the other side. So stitch, middle, stitch. If you've ever done a regular satin stitch or zigzag stitch, what happens is a lot of times it's going to want to tunnel. With that extra little stitch in the middle, it's not going to tunnel. If it were to tunnel, it would get bulky and it wouldn't be a nice flat edge on my seam, on the edge of my fabric. So it's going to go. The other advantage of it is this triple zigzag is going to go pretty fast. You may have a lot of seams you have to overcast the edge of. So this is going to rock and roll. So it overcasted the edge, put that thread on the edge there, and this is not going to ravel. Now, admittedly, it's not the prettiest edge. There's a lot of ways to finish the edge of a woven fabric in a seam. Tons of ways. This is one of the most simple ones. If you're going to do a garment where the seams are going to be exposed on the inside and they need to be pretty, then you want to explore some of those other seam finishes. There's a French seam, there's tons of seams that the inside is just as pretty on the outside, but for this garment, this is going to be okay for me. Now I've overcast both of the edges of my fabric, and I'm going to do a standard seam coming down to put these two pieces of woven fabric together. Another advantage of an electronic machine is many times they have what's called an automatic locking stitch. On this Janome, it's stitch number 2 or stitch number 3. I'm going to select stitch number 2, automatically set up for me. And what an automatic locking stitch does, it'll reinforce the beginning of your seam so it doesn't pull apart. And when you reach the end, you simply tell the machine, I've reached the end of my seam, and it'll automatically lock that end. And then when it starts the next seam, it'll automatically lock it as well. So I'm going to put my fabric in. On this particular piece, maybe I have a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I find that guideline on the needle plate, and that's going to help me guide the perfect seam allowance for this particular garment. Now I've chosen stitch number 2. It's automatically going to lock at the beginning. So, oh, and now this woven fabric may not get pulled down into that needle plate area. I'm going to take a chance. I don't think I need to use my little tearaway. Let's see if I'm okay. Good to go. Now it automatically reinforced at the very beginning. I'm doing my straight stitch. Now I've stopped. I'm not at the end of my seam. I need to tell the machine when I've reached the end by pushing this little button down here that looks like a reverse. So I'm going to come to the end, push that little button. The machine's going to automatically reinforce that seam, and press my scissors. When I start sewing my next seam, it's automatically going to reinforce it as well. Stitch number 3 doesn't go in reverse, it just stitches in place. So you have 2 choices for whatever type of reinforcement you want on either end of your seam. Now I have another seam. How many times have I said seam? We're going to do a knit to a woven, which is kind of unique. I'm actually going to use that same stitch that I used for the reinforcement of the knit shoulder seam. But I'm going to use the foot that the machine recommends, which is foot number C. It's kind of special because it has, on the underside of the foot, it has 2 little bars. I'm going to be sewing over the edge of this seam and be sewing kind of in the air. And this foot helps the machine lay those stitches down flat. Just like that triple zigzag did, it didn't curl up. When I use this foot on stitch number 9, and the machine recommends that I do that, it already tells me I need foot number C. I put that foot on and I have a guideline. It's going to hold the fabric nice and flat, and I'm going to have a beautiful result. Now, what may be true also is when you're sewing a very long seam that's a knit to a woven, sometimes because the foot's doing all kinds of action to get that over edge finish and the seam, what's going to happen is sometimes it kind of chews up that seam, chews up the edge, and you might get a slight ripple. How do we avoid that? Well, I use a stabilizer called a washaway, and this happens to be a tacky washaway. It is a stabilizer that I put in little strips along the side of the seam, and it keeps it from stretching or distorting as I stitch. I use the tacky because it just lays down, stays on the seam. I don't have to worry about pinning it down. As I sew, it's going to keep that seam nice and stable, and I'm not going to end up with wavy seam, which would be unattractive on the front of my garment. So I've already put some stabilizer on the side. I've put my foot on. And now all I have to do is use the guide on the foot to help me and just sew my seam. This seam's going to take a little bit while as well because it's doing all kinds of back and forth action. So it's going to take me a while. I'm going to leave the speed of the machine all the way to the top, and I have a ways to go. So I'm going to finish off my seam. Don't forget, you have a handout that talks through all of these different seams. When we come back, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have all my seams finished, and we're going to see if we can mimic that hem that a serger does called a cover stitch. We're going to see if we can do it on the sewing machine. I think we can. Let me finish this and we'll be right back. See if we can do it. So I finished out my seam, and you can see it's lying really, really nice and flat. This wash away stabilizer, I can pull it away, but quite frankly, I don't have to. It's just going to wash away first time I wash it, or if I get it wet and soak it, going to completely go away, and I have a nice flat seam. So now, let's change over so that we can mimic that cover stitch hem that looks so beautiful on a garment, especially a knit. Now on this machine, it's a zigzag machine, so it will take a double needle. And a double needle is a needle that has 2 needles on one shank. So this inserts into the machine and both needles are working at the same time. It comes with a double needle, but the double needle it comes with is somewhat narrow. I prefer a wider one. You can use any kind of width that you want. They have 2 millimeter, 3 millimeter. This is a 4 millimeter. You choose the one that works for you. I'm going to use the 4 millimeter. Your handout talks about the different types of double needles that there are. And if you're going to do a stitch, say you're working on a knit and you're skipping stitches, you may need to use a stretch or a ballpoint needle. They make those in double needles. They also make them in single needles as well. So if you're doing any kind of a knit seam, you may need to use those. Handout talks all about it. Now we're going to switch over to use the double needle. Now when you thread your machine, in the instruction book there's simple instructions for threading a double needle. Basically the thread all commingles till it gets to the 2 needles at the bottom, and then you split it out and thread the 2 needles separately. We're not going to be able to use our needle threader for this. We're going to have to do it the old-fashioned way. And even though this machine has a cutter, I tend to not use the cutter when I'm using a specialty needle like a twin needle. I just don't want it to actually accidentally get caught on the needle. I err on the side of not using that. So let's switch everything over. I'm going to take out the old needle and insert the twin needle. It has a flat shank on the back as well, and it just slides on in. And I tighten it up like I do a traditional one. Now what you're going to need 2 threads for that needle. This has an auxiliary spool pin that goes on the top of the machine, and I have wound a bobbin in my identical thread. You may not have 2 matching thread spools, so you can always wind a bobbin and use that for your second thread. Both of these threads are going to thread just the same, in the same path. And when we get down to the very bottom, one thread's going to go into one needle and one thread's going to go into the other needle. Now when I do my hem, what I do is, it's usually a pretty narrow hem. I turn it up and decide how deep it's going to be, and I use something to stabilize that, because generally that's the stretchiest part of your knit. I either use what's called a wash away tape. It's sticky on the one side, and it sticks on into the fabric, and it'll kind of help stabilize it and hold it up. Quite frankly, my preference is I use a fusible, this is called Applique Wonder, and it's sticky, but it has a fusible on the one side. So I take a small strip of it, I put it on my hem, where's my hem, and when I turn it up, I put the sticky side down, and then I go to my iron and I literally fuse it on down. It's going to hold that. I don't have any pins to worry about. I don't have to use any clips, and it holds it beautifully when I'm stitching. So it's in your handout. I just use that Applique Wonder to hold it on up. Now I'm going to be stitching around the leg, which is the hem. So I'm going to take off the little table that comes with the machine, and I'm going to use the free arm of the machine. And it's going to fit right around there. This machine also comes with a seam guide, and that's going to be key because you're going to be sewing on the top side of the fabric, and you're going to be wanting to cover that raw edge on the back. And so I'm going to have to determine how deep my hem is. I'm going to put my seam guide on, and that's going to help me to sew the right distance from the edge, so that I'm covering with one needle on one side and one needle on the other side. I'm covering that edge. So let's get to sewing, and we'll see if we can mimic what that cover stitch does. Okay, so I've threaded my needles. I had to do it by hand. And I've put my seam guide on there to make sure I can keep the edge of my fabric right where it needs to be, and I'm going to cover that edge. Here's something that's in your handout, and it's super important. I want to use a straight stitch on this machine. That's stitch number 1, and I want it to be in the center needle position. Because this twin needle is wide, I don't want the needle going back and forth because that will break your twin needle. You don't want to do that. So I have it in the center needle position. I'm simply going to sew a straight line, and it's going to give me 2 rows of stitching. Something to think about. Even though I put that stabilizer in there, if you do a sample and you're starting to get some wavy, you can loosen the pressure on your pressure foot. If it still gives you some trouble, you might want to explore a roller foot. This machine doesn't come with one, but they're a very inexpensive accessory that you can get that's really going to help you on some types of stitching. Let's see what it looks like. It's really simple. You're just doing a straight stitch and the machine is splitting both of those threads and you're getting the results that you want. I'm going to finish this on up. Remember, when I get finished, I'm not going to use that scissor. As I come to my beginning, I want to make sure I hit over those same threads so that it looks continuous. Needle up, lift the presser foot, gently pull it on out, and oh my goodness, kind of looks super professional. So I think I did mimic what a serger can do on my sewing machine. Just a few things to set up and I got the results that I wanted. So, electronic machine can help you get your garment ready, good to go. Just a few different types of seams. This machine, great machine for being able to take it up, put it down, put it away between sewing, and I think we've covered most of the basic sewing machine garment seams. George, do you have anything to say?
Thanks, Kathy. That was another incredible presentation. Don't forget to click on the link where you can download Kathy's guide to the presentation. The Janome 4120QDC-T is our most popular portable machine. It weighs a mere 13 pounds, but it sews like a top model machine. It has a 7-piece feed system. Now what this does, it gives wonderful fabric control from sewing with heavy fabric, working with sheer fabric, working with knit fabric. It really does handle the fabric beautifully. Plus it has 120 built-in stitches that are easily accessed by its screen. And you have all kinds of stitches, including applique and quilting stitches and all kinds of blanket stitches, utility, buttonholes. It has 7 different buttonholes that are auto-sized just by putting the button in the foot. It also has an automatic thread cutter, an automatic needle threader, as well as comes with a wide selection of bonus accessories, which include this walking foot for working with layers of fabric, this guide that attaches to the walking foot. It comes with a secondary guide. It comes with a 1/4-inch patchwork foot that is great for chain piecing, as well as an open toe free motion foot. This machine is an incredible value. It has a retail price of $1,299, and with all the values this offers, it's worth that. But we have it on sale right now for $699, and this is while this machine is in stock. We're also including free shipping. But don't wait, these will sell out very quickly. Click on the link to order your machine or give us a call at 1-800-865-9664. Bye for now.